Hello and welcome back to History Made Simply. This is Nick Shaw, the site's senior historian, and today we're going to be discussing a complex question. Why did the first Industrial Revolution happen in the UK first? Well, there are a wide variety of reasons for this. There's geology, there are political reasons, there are financial reasons, there are social reasons, and there are geographical reasons why this occurred. But perhaps the very first question is, why am I talking about the first Industrial Revolution? Well, because there were more than one. And indeed, the second Industrial Revolution, which can be said to have happened the middle third of the 19th century, was not led by Britain. And again, when we come on to what amounted to the second Industrial Revolution, you will hear why. So, the first Industrial Revolution. The first Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain. It wasn't just England. The Industrial Revolution also took place partially in Wales and also in southern Scotland. Very little of the Industrial Revolution took place in Ireland. The reasons are geological, as I said, political, financial, social, and geography. Now, the Industrial Revolution is not only about James Watt watching a kettle boil. This is surely a story that many listeners will be familiar with. James Watt watched his mother boiling a kettle over their open fire in their kitchen and thought, well, just a minute, if steam can push the lid of a kettle up and down, surely it can do something else. So Watt's life was largely involved around the taming, if you like, of steam. Anyway, we'll come back to James Watt when we actually get to steam. Steam is not the energy system of the first Industrial Revolution. First, water power and wind power both played a part in the early part of the Industrial Revolution. So one of the reasons that the Industrial Revolution took place in the northern part of the UK was because there were many fast-flowing streams and small rivers which could power a water wheel, and indeed did so. Other places, more flatter country, there was wind. And even today, as we know, wind can give a lot of energy. So let's deal firstly with the geological reasons why the Industrial Revolution took place in England first. The British Isles are essentially very well off for coal, and indeed today we still have we could probably run, if we wanted to help destroy the environment, we could probably run most of our energy requirements on coal still today. We don't want to because it's a dirty method of producing energy. But Britain has plenty of coal. It has coal in South Wales, it has coal in, unbelievably, and this probably isn't that well known, it has coal in Kent, it has coal in the Midlands, in Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, even a little bit in Leicestershire. It has masses of coal in South Wales, and it's important from a geological point of view to realise that there are different grades of coal. The best coal, now why is some coal better than others? Different qualities of coal produce different calorific values per pound or kilo, whichever system you happen to be working in. Now, South Wales, for example, has some of the best coal in the world, and it's called anthracite. And that means that a kilo of anthracite burns a lot better than a kilo of, for example, the coal that's to be found in Kent. That obviously was not known at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and was something that had to be found out. Anyway, going back to the original forms of power, which is fast-flowing water, which can turn a water wheel, and there are still plenty of examples of water wheels operating throughout the UK. For example, there's a good one in Bridport in Dorset, where a water wheel drives a flour mill. Now, flour obviously was something that we needed to create a huge amount of on an annual basis. And there were many flour mills to be found in Lancashire, which is of course why you might realise that the term mill applies to the early factories that were established there. So there were flour mills long before there were mills dealing with the weaving and dyeing of cotton in Lancashire, or the weaving and dyeing of wool in Yorkshire, which are two keystones of the Industrial Revolution. So, geologically, there's plenty of coal, but also there's plenty of iron, and iron that's fairly uncluttered with other additives in it. This does not apply in much of the rest of Western Europe. For example, German iron ore, for example, is tainted, not everywhere, but in most parts of Germany, with sulphur, which means it has to go through an extra process before it can be turned either into cast iron, wrought iron, or ultimately steel. So having covered one of the reasons why we got the Industrial Revolution first, i.e. we're an island of coal and quite pure iron ore, let's move on. As I've already mentioned, before the steam engine, there was wind power and water power, which meant that factories, for example, that were turning cotton first into thread and then dyeing it and then turning it into cloth grew up where there were hills and then there were plains. And a good example of that is to be found in Lancashire. And so the Industrial Revolution started in places like Lancashire and Yorkshire because of the fast-flowing streams and small rivers, because that powered, most of the year anyway, powered water wheels. Water wheels could then turn, for example, two stones between which you could feed wheat or corn, and you could turn it into flour. You could also do the same with rye and to a lesser extent with maize. Anyway, so there are of course other places in England where
wind power was handy. Notably, the Fenlands, that's North West Norfolk, North Cambridge and South Lincolnshire. In other words, the land that's around the Wash. And there, also because they had an influx of Dutch people, because Holland's not very far from the coast of Norfolk, windmills were an important feature of the landscape. Now, windmills weren't only used to grind corn and turn it into flour. They were used to do things like drain wetlands. It's important to realise, for example, that much of that area of the countryside was, in fact, a swamp. Certainly in the 17th century. How do we know this? Because we know that Oliver Cromwell died from malaria. Now, he can't have got malaria from land that was well drained. He got it because there was still plenty of swamp left in the mid-17th century. That would change because, of course, what happened in the mid-17th century was that large numbers of landowners had to flee the country because they'd lost the English Civil War. And they went to Holland, and they saw what the Dutch were doing with a flat but waterlogged land, and how they were producing much higher crop yields than we were, because they had fertile and well-watered land. But the problem with water is you need to control it. And so that's why the Dutch built dikes and used windmills to pump water out of low-lying land and into the dikes. The same was true when English landowners came back from Holland with the Restoration in the 1660s. They started to realise that they could recover land that was previously unusable for more or less anything other than growing weeping willows, which incidentally were pretty good for firing. By firing, I mean log fires. One thing that wasn't happening very much at this stage, like we're talking mid-17th century, was coal being used to heat houses and for industrial purposes, like, for example, making glass, brewing beer, and of course, eventually, when steam engines came along, producing energy that could be applied within the context of a mill or a factory. So, when did the Industrial Revolution really begin to take off? Well, it began to take off largely because of financial reasons. From 1690 onwards, Britain was engaged in a series of lengthy wars with France. We always made sure that we had supporters on land in Europe, but mainly we had the Navy. The Navy ensured that Britain became, certainly by the third quarter of the 18th century, the predominant naval power in the world. There were British ships travelling all over the world, even eventually after Captain Cook's journeys, taking convicts to Australia. Now, that meant we were trading a lot. So we were trading with India, we were trading with China, but to a much lesser extent. We were trading with the Americas, we were trading with the Near East,
It was called the Levant trade. All of this was creating profits, and the profits were looking for somewhere safe to put their money. But eventually, as the Industrial Revolution got underway, there were people making massive profits. Many of you will have heard of Sir Robert Peel. Of course, he wasn't originally Sir, he was just Robert Peel. Now, Peel was a Conservative politician, a Tory politician, who came from a very successful industrial family. And they were amongst one of the first families who became what were called millionaires. A really good income for a member of the aristocracy or a rich member of the gentry, a really good income in the middle of the 18th century would have been £5,000 to £10,000. The Peels in the early part of the 19th century were earning hundreds of thousands of pounds a year and had capital well in excess of £1 million. This was because of the Industrial Revolution. But going back to the period before the Industrial Revolution had started, there was a lot of money coming into England. Not only because of overseas trade that we would understand today, i.e. goods going out in merchant ships and being sold in faraway countries, but because of another more odious form of trade, the slave trade. Now, the slave trade was largely triangular. What would happen is the slaver would start normally from either Bristol, Chepstow or Liverpool. It would take trinkets, mirrors, for example, small face mirrors, to West Africa, where they would swap mirrors, beads, all sorts of little manufactured items for normally prisoners of war. West Africa was full of small and medium-sized kingdoms that were constantly at war with each other, and one of the things that happened is they captured each other's warriors. So there was a ready supply of muscly young men who could be shipped out, for example, originally to what were called the Sugar Isles. That's the Caribbean islands. They were called the Sugar Isles for a very simple reason. That's where sugar was grown, processed, and sent to England, amongst many, many, many other countries. The French had a sugar industry. The Dutch had a sugar industry. The Spanish had sugar industries. This was one of the first driving forces that helped create the capital to fund the Industrial Revolution. And of course, if you have a powerful and successful navy, the chances are you're going to get more and more control of things like the triangular trade, the trade from the UK, West Africa, to the Caribbean, where you sold your slaves. You then needed to turn the money that you'd made from selling the slaves into something. You bought sugar, partially refined, either as actual refined lump sugar, or you bought it as molasses. Molasses was handy to fuel, if you like, the start of processed foods. Anyway, so sugar would come back to England from the Caribbean. So that was the triangular trade. Now, the triangular trade was certainly going more or less from the end of the 17th century onwards. Gradually, the ports of Chepstow and of Bristol didn't exactly fall by the wayside, but they stopped dealing in slaves. Slavery mainly became a function that was operated out of Liverpool. So we have a lot of money pouring into the northwest of England because of the slave trade, because of the sugar trade, and it was looking for a home and something to do with. So when James Watt came along with his first steam engines, there were people with so much money, relatively speaking, that they were willing to take big risks with at least a portion of it. If you wanted to invest your money safely, you could put it into government securities, called in those days consols. Consols paid between 2.5% and 4%, depending on whether Britain was at war or at peace. Well, not terribly. If you're making, as for example the Peels were by the very early 19th century, but many other people were making lots and lots and lots of profit in the UK by the 1740s. Banks were spreading. You could actually, as long as it was well secured, normally on agricultural land, you could borrow money from banks. You couldn't borrow money from banks if you were touting a steam engine around, but because of the sugar trade, there were people, and the slave trade, there were people bringing huge profits back to England. Profits that they put a lot into consols, but they wanted a home where they could make more than 4 or 5%. Well, even before the steam engine, if you invested money, for example, in a mill driven by water power that was consistent through the year, you could probably make a 15, maybe even a 20% return on your cash invested in that business. Well, it doesn't take a genius to work out that some people are going to risk the bit of their profits that they feel is worth a high gamble. That's going to go into much higher risk areas, giving much better returns. Well, 5 times what the government are giving you on lending them money to wage war and pay off the national debt is clearly a risk worth taking. So that really, to some extent, covers the actual financial reason why Britain was one of the first countries to get involved in the Industrial Revolution. There is another, it's financial, but it's also social reason, and that is the rise of the joint stock company. Many of you will have heard of the South Sea Bubble. Now, the South Sea Bubble was a craze, I think is probably the best way to describe it. Indeed, one could perhaps even go further and call it a mania. People chose to invest without knowledge in all sorts of companies. Now, these companies were joint stock companies. They could have large numbers of shareholders, so you could buy shares. And it didn't take long for the more criminal element, but the educated criminal element of the country to realise that there was money to be had quite easily. Now, the very first bubble, if you like, happened not in England, but in Holland. Holland was financially and economically far more advanced than Britain was in the late 17th and very early 18th century. And in the late 1600s, there occurred the first huge financial investment bubble. And almost unbelievably, it revolved around tulip bulbs. Tulips are a plant that comes from the East Indies. The Dutch were one of the first people to trade in the East Indies, and they brought back all sorts of things, including tulip bulbs. But one thing to remember about the Dutch is, in the 17th century, their agricultural sector was much more sophisticated than almost everywhere else, not just in Europe, but globally. And as we've already mentioned, they had lots and lots of windmills. Now, the windmills created power to shift water, but they also created power to grind corn, and indeed grind anything else that might need to be crushed. So the Dutch had lots of windmills, but there was a part of England where it was very similar geographically to Holland, and that part we've already mentioned is North West Norfolk, North Cambridgeshire, and South Lincolnshire. It's very flat. If it's very flat and by the sea, and much of it is by the sea, because of the wash, you get lots of wind, and the wind blows fairly consistently. The wind has to blow fairly consistently to make it worthwhile building windmills. So you can't build windmills. You can either build windmills on the top of hills. That's what they do, for example, in Spain, what they did in Spain, or you can build them in very flat land. But there are also, of course, parts of Lancashire that are very flat, by the rivers, for example. And so there were also windmills in the plains of Lancashire. So this gave us two sources of energy, even before steam. The two sources of energy, as I've said, were wind and water. Now, the water, of course, does have one major problem. If it doesn't rain, in other words, if you have a dry year or dry 2 years, you can have a situation where the flow of water is so reduced it won't turn your water wheel. That, to some extent, is why when James Watt came along with his first steam engines, people running mills were interested in them, because what they wanted was production, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year, with 12-hour shifts. That's what they wanted. Now, if your fast-flowing stream dried up, there was no power to turn the water wheel, and so there was no operation inside the mill. So that is why, when James Watt did come along with the steam engine, it was very, very well received. So most historians date the beginning of the Industrial Revolution starting in the second half of the 19th century in Great Britain. The place is right, the timing's open to discussion. There were families, and surprisingly lots of them were Quakers, who were involved in smelting iron, for example, well before the second half of the 18th century. Now, there always have to be trailblazers, and in the case of casting iron, the trailblazer was a man called Abraham Darby. Now, Abraham Darby had 6 direct descendants, and they were all called Abraham Darby, so there were 7 Abraham Darbys. Now, the first Abraham Darby was not involved originally in
smelting iron. In other words, he wasn't a blacksmith. What he was a brewer, or what was called a maltster in those days. In other words, he cooked malt, and and you could turn malt into alcohol, normally beer. Why was this important? You wouldn't want to have drunk in any large town or city. You wouldn't have wanted to have drunk straight from the rivers or streams running through the city or town, or indeed from the wells. Well, that was a quick way to get typhoid, cholera, and any number of other diseases that could kill you. Anyway, he discovered, incidentally, something which the ancient Chinese had discovered before the birth of Christ. He discovered how to turn coal into coke. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that you learn that by cooking coal, you can turn it into coke. Well, what's the advantage of this? Right, first of all, you're getting rid of the impurities that are present in the coal, which could, for example, be sulfur, could be phosphorus, could be a number of other additives that exist in different types of coal. Now, obviously, as he was originally a brewer, you didn't want your malted grain tasting of sulfur or phosphorus or any other thing. So one of the things that they learnt fairly quickly was how to burn coal a little bit to get rid of the things you didn't want in the coal, and that turned it into what was called coke. Coke was purer, much purer, and it burnt at a much higher calorific level per pound or per kilo. So he knew this. Now he also, because the first Abraham Darby was rather an adventurous chap, he knew that there were other things you could do with coke other than brew beer, ultimately. Now, as I said, I would mention in passing that even children drank weak beer throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century, because it was a lot safer to drink than water drawn from streams, rivers, or wells that were in towns or cities. Because obviously, one of the things that towns and cities collect immense quantities of is human waste, animal waste. I mean, serious amounts of horse shit. Horse shit, for example, became such a serious problem in New York in the late 19th century that it almost brought the city to a standstill. Anyway, there's plenty of waste. So what Abraham Darby did was he, not the first one, not even the second one, but the third one, moved from brewing in Bristol to cooking coke and smelting iron at a place that came to be called Ironbridge. Now, why was it called? One can easily imagine why it was called Ironbridge, and that was because one of the things that he had developed was a method of casting iron through making sand moulds. So in other words, you melt your iron or over coke, which burnt hotter than coal, and you'd pour it into a mould. And that mould could be making either pots and pans, certainly something that the Darbys were involved in more or less from the outset of their move to what came to be known as Iron Bridge, which is near Coalbrookdale, in the northwest Midlands. But you could also make, they gradually worked out, much bigger items. Now, for example, amongst those much bigger items were all the bits of iron that go on canal locks or river locks. You need iron machinery to open and close locks. And of course that then enabled the construction of canals. Prior to the 18th century, there were very, very few canals. In fact, there were no canals really to speak of. What there were cuts where a mature river with lots of S bends, you could do a cut from the bottom of one bend, maybe bypass 2 or 3 bends, and you could then reconnect it to the river. And that, for example, a good example of this being done was in Hampshire. There's the River Itchen, which runs through Winchester, and Winchester Cathedral, built in the early Middle Ages, it is not exclusively, but uses a lot of stone that came from Caen in Normandy. Now, obviously, that was during the era where the kings of England were also dukes of Normandy, and there were various cuts made to make the use of the River Itchen much more practical. So the Caen stone could be transferred to barges and pulled up the River Itchen and through the cuts that shortened the distance that had to be travelled. And you could then put maybe one horse towing 10 tons of stone. Well, this is a lot better than trying to put it on carts. A lot more efficient, and the stone's going to get there faster and it's going to get there intact. So eventually the concept that you should develop canals became a very important feature of the first industrial revolution. And by the very early 19th century, the 7 major estuaries of England's rivers, that's the Mersey, the Trent, the Severn, the Thames, those are the ones in southern and central England, they were all connected. They were connected by canals. And eventually, it was possible to deliver goods to Liverpool and send them by canal to Hull. So let's say, for example, you wanted to import buffalo skins. Buffalo skins were quite handy because they can be made into coats that would keep you warm whilst you were travelling on your stagecoach, or if you're a wealthier individual, in your own coach. And they could keep you dry if you had to get out of the coach and it was raining. So there was the demand, obviously, and no doubt there was some enterprising chap in Liverpool or Hull, or perhaps both working together, who was already by, shall we say, 1750, 1760, was already importing buffalo hides from North America, shipping them across on the canal system to Hull and sending them to St. Petersburg, or for that matter, Sweden or Norway or Denmark or Germany, all places where it gets very cold in the winter. Now, don't get me wrong, of course, they had their own skins, but increasingly, not admittedly during the the American War of Independence, but at all other times that we're discussing, there were unquestionably traffic that went from Canada and North America through England to the rest of Europe. Now, this was the case also because of economics. There was no free trade to speak of in the late 17th, early 18th and middle of the 18th century. What do I mean by free trade? Free trade means the free passage of goods and services. Well, this quite simply didn't happen. Why not? Well, because largely governments, and that it means in the case of most of Europe, it means kings who, unlike Charles I, did not get their head chopped off by Parliament. Kings were absolute monarchs throughout most of Europe, including France. The only place where they weren't absolute was Great Britain. Now, that is because in the late 17th century, we had a king called James II. James II was the brother of Charles II, the son of Charles I, the king who had his head chopped off. James II was, shall we say, a Catholic fellow traveller. And of course, England was largely owned and operated by the Protestant ascendancy. The aristocracy and gentry were pretty well all Protestants. There were a few Catholics, but very, very few. So there was what amounted to a civil war. And the Civil War didn't last very long. And in 1688, what happened was the British aristocracy and gentry invited the sister of James II, Mary, to come with her Dutch husband, William, Prince of Orange, to become the only joint monarchy that Britain has ever had, William and Mary. And William and Mary effectively ruled until the very early 18th century, when their sister Anne became queen, after both of them had passed. Anyway, William and Mary arrived, and it was an event that came to be known as the Glorious Revolution. Now, why is this important to the Industrial Revolution? Because it ensured that a variety of things that absolute monarchs did were not done in England. For example, Louis XIV and his successors and many other European monarchs made money out of granting monopolies. In England, there were no monopolies. Anybody could get involved in any business they wanted to. Now, this was a uniquely British, although American as well, and of course in places like Canada, which remained British even after the American War of Independence, and indeed benefited from the American War of Independence because people that didn't like the concept of an independent America moved to Canada. One of the things that we had learnt, I think, even by then, was that it was a very bad idea to impose difficult rules and regulations for people to live under. So, for example, even though we had conquered Canada in 1759, Canada, the French part of Canada, remained French. It remained Catholic, and it remained French-speaking, and culturally was a little part of France, and it remains that way even today. Quebec and Montreal are very French cities. Anyway, but the French people who lived in Canada and the Scottish people who moved to Canada from the Highlands and the English people who moved to Canada could buy and sell goods. They could if they could find mines, they could set up mines. If they could find, there was thousands and thousands of square miles of good timber. They could set up sawmills. All of these things they could do without the king or queen interfering. This was simply not the case in either the French world, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire. In fact, it was not the case in any other empire. Freedom to move your money and to do what you want with it was almost a uniquely British and, of course, American thing. That is really why that's the key reason why the Industrial Revolution took place in England first. As we've said, England's, Canadians and Americans were big traders. Goods were shipped. The trade in the Atlantic Ocean grew by leaps and bounds in the 18th century. Anyway, so all of these people, not only the ones who actually lived in England and profited from overseas trade, from the sugar trade, from slavery, all of these people had spare cash. And as I've mentioned before, you could put your cash safely into lending the government money, but maximum you were going to be getting was 4%. Well, even before steam engines were being installed in what came to be called factories, but shall we say, for the sake of argument, were at that stage called mills, even then, what was going on inside a mill could give you a 15 to 20% return per annum. That's the reason why people were increasingly willing to lend surplus capital, at least a portion, 10-15% of their surplus capital, to people operating what had become called mills. So, let's go back to our friend Abraham Darby, and we're at the third member of the family called Abraham Darby. So the first, let's deal with the first Abraham. Let's deal with Abraham Darby's in order of precedence. So the first Abraham Darby, he was born in 1678 and died in 1717. He was a malt mill owner, as we've said, and he was supplying the brewers of Bristol. He was, however, but he got an inquiring mind, and he wanted to get into other things. And he noticed that iron pots and pans were coming in from Holland and were both popular but pricey. In 1704, he visited Holland to look at the process of making iron pots and realised he could probably do it better and cheaper in England. With a fellow Quaker, John Thomas, he experimented on cheaper processes for turning iron ore into pots and pans. And in 1707, they patented the casting of pots in sand moulds. In 1709, they moved up the River Severn to Coalbrookdale in Shropshire, where all the raw materials, coal to turn into, which can be cooked into being coke, very pure iron ore and fast-flowing streams all existed. So you had water wheels that could power, but you also had coke that could smelt fairly large quantities of iron, and you could turn it into, yes, you could turn it into pots and pans, but you could also turn it into industrial products, roof trusses for factories, all the metal bits that go on locks that can take you up and down hill in a canal. And believe you me, there were already quite a lot of locks by the middle of the 18th century. So although, as we've said, coal being turned into coke was a process which, for example, had been understood in China centuries before the birth of Christ, it was developed as a fuel by brewers in Bristol, making brewing far more efficient than using charcoal as a fuel. It should also be remembered that by this stage, we had chopped down a large amount of the forests of England. Really, there was the Forest of Dean was left, the New Forest was left, and the New Forest was more or less inviolate. But because we had been building up one of the largest navies in the world, and because we had been building up a very large merchant fleet, most of the usable timber had gone. So that's why we needed to bring timber in from the Baltic and from Canada, which we did. But of course, timber is a bulky product. So that is one of the reasons why cuts were replaced by canals. A canal, a shire horse pulling a barge loaded with, for example, 5 to 10 tons of pig iron, you need one dull, plodding cart horse pulling it. If you're Wedgwood, it's a damn sight safer to move your goods by canal from the potteries either to Liverpool and Hull for export, or to move them to London, the largest consumer market in Great Britain. But it wasn't the only consumer market in Great Britain. And in fact, some of the very first canals were built to deliver coal from the mines to Manchester. Manchester, even by the beginning of the 18th century, was no longer like a small village. It was quite a large town because it was connected to the sea by the River Mersey, and cuts were necessary. But from Manchester, a whole network of canals began to be built. And we'll come on to the people who were involved in canal building in a minute. So let's go back to our friends, the Derby family. So casting iron products in sand moulds, as I said, that this was a process that was patented by the Derbys. They weren't, of course, the only people doing it, but the Derbys, being Quakers, were against violence, but they weren't against going to court. And so anybody not paying them a percentage for using the process of pouring liquid iron into sand moulds was going to eventually get a good caning in the courts. Might have taken 5 years, might have taken 10 years, but they were still going to be in trouble, and they would be paying Abraham Derby and his family, and remember there are 7 Abraham Derbys, they'd be paying him a royalty. The Derbys had gone to Coalbrookdale, and they began smelting pots and pans. They began smelting, as we've said, all the bits for the metal bits that go on canal locks. It became far easier to use cast iron in the making of things like window frames. It became quite easy to use it for the making of door frames, and also pillars to hold up your roof. Didn't matter whether your roof was a domestic roof or the industrial roof over a mill. An iron pillar was a lot more efficient, and in some ways easier to come by than the equivalent in wood. And it could certainly support a lot heavier load. So these were some of the that was one lot of industrial uses. Other uses, well, obviously, one of the reasons that the Derbys moved to Coalbrookdale was because it was on the River Severn. So one of the first things they started doing was making iron barges to transport either finished consumer goods like pots and pans down the Severn to Bristol, and eventually, after the canal system had been built, to London. But they were also in a position to send, once the canal system, as I say, had been constructed, which largely the canal system in and around Manchester had been constructed by, certainly by the latter third of the 18th century. And this meant that, for example, it became possible to move large quantities of slightly lower calorific, not necessarily the best calorific, but lower calorific coal in quantity to towns and cities. Now, really, the canal system was completed by the first decade of the 19th century. And indeed, if you want to read a very good account of travel on the canal system as it was at the beginning of the 19th century, you could do worse than read a book by a very well-known author called C.S. Forrester called Hornblower and the Atropos. Hornblower was his principal naval invention. Hornblower is a naval officer serving from broadly the decade before the start of the Revolutionary Wars, through the Revolutionary Wars, and up to and including the Waterloo campaign and beyond. Indeed, one of the best Hornblower novels is called Hornblower in the West Indies, where he's already an admiral. Anyway, let's divert back from Hornblower to the Industrial Revolution. So there's a very, very good account of travelling on the canals at the beginning of the 19th century in this Hornblower novel. Right, back to more basic things. So, one of the things that the Derbys had discovered as maltsters was that turning coal into coke removes sulphur. Now, so that's extremely good news, because removing sulphur turns coal into coke, and it burns then at a much higher and purer heat. Surprisingly, Abraham Derby and his family were Quakers. Now, Quakers were a sect within the Protestant faith that were accepted in Britain and tolerated. Again, another very simple reason why the first industrial revolution took place in Britain. Britain had, after the glorious revolution of 1688, Britain became an increasingly tolerant place. It didn't matter where your money came from. You weren't going to have it taken off you by the aristocracy. So there was a large influx of Jews, because Jews came to realise that in England they would not be persecuted. Jews outside of the UK, Jews were not allowed to own land. So they got into banking very early. And because they realised that they would not be persecuted, they would not be murdered for practising their faith in England, they came in increasingly large numbers, and they bought working capital with them. They bought bars of silver, bars of gold. They bought precious stones, small portable wealth. All of this was required because the banking system in Great Britain throughout the 18th century was relatively primitive. There were indeed massive banking crises. The very first one being, of course, the South Sea Bubble. Now, the South Sea Bubble only became possible because of joint stock companies. Joint stock companies were a way where many people could band together and invest small or large sums of money in a business idea or in trading. And this led to in Holland, the first manic market, which was unbelievably in tulip bulbs, but it also led to a manic market in nothing, which is what the South Sea Bubble was about. And indeed, famously, one of the promotional documents of one company involved in the South Sea Bubble said that this was a company being formed for a purpose which had not yet been decided. People still invested. The bubble burst in 1720, and lots of people lost lots of money, but not everybody lost money. Some people had sold out before the bubble burst, and some people just made money out of inflating the bubble. And we'll be dealing with both of those types of individuals on another day. Anyway, because England, Wales and Scotland were overseas traders on quite a large scale, it inevitably followed that banking became part of the British landscape. Some banks were owned and operated by Jewish people. Some banks were owned and operated by families, like, for example, the Barclays. The Barclays, although I doubt whether the Barclays Bank would make much of a fuss about it, the Barclays provided a considerable amount of the finance that financed the triangular trade from Bristol to West Africa to the Caribbean and then back to England. Now, the triangular trade, as we've said, largely involved trading in slaves. The key multiplying factor in the triangular trade was how many live slaves you could put on the auction block in Jamaica, for example, or in Barbados. That then gave you the cash to buy the semi-refined or refined sugar, which you could put in your ship and sail back to England and sell at an enormous profit. So the thing about the triangular trade is there was a profit when you bought the slaves, there was a profit when you sold the slaves. There was a profit, and by that time you'd made quite a lot of profit, believe me. There was then a profit when you bought the sugar, took it back to England and sold it. The thing about sugar is, it's a good preservative, but once you get into sugar, it's addictive. It's a drug. Sugar's like any other drug. It's once you're into it, you're stuck. Anyway, that's where a lot of the working capital for the Industrial Revolution came from. So, to some extent, we've dealt with geology, in that we've pointed out that England was a country, an island of coal and good quality pure iron ore. And it was also a country where the movement of capital and cash was free. There were no monopolies being granted by kings from Hanover, which is what we had from 1714 onwards. There were no monopolies controlled by aristocrats. Aristocrats had a lot of land. Land was the main driver of cash creation in the UK in the 18th century. But other than buying more land, and land became increasingly difficult to buy in quantity in England as the 18th century went on, there wasn't an awful lot you could do with your profits. And there were lots of profits. There was, as we've said, there was profits from international trading. There was profits from the early part of the Industrial Revolution. That would be weaving cotton in Lancashire and weaving woolen products in Yorkshire. And then along came the steam engine. Now, the steam engine was a giant step forward as a source of energy. As long as you had coal and water and a working steam engine, you had energy 24/7, 52 weeks of the year. This couldn't be said for wind power, and it certainly couldn't be said for water power. Also, it could do things like improve your canal system. One of the problems with canals is that the land isn't completely flat. So when you come to a hill, you can either cut your way through it, maybe have a few locks going up, then a level part, and then a few locks coming down, or you can dig a tunnel through the hill, or as I said, you can go round the hill. You can't have a canal that works any other way. And of course, originally, most canals ran close to rivers because rivers are a source of motive power for canals. Without water, your canal's just a dry ditch. It was the landed people and the traders of goods going overseas and coming back who had spare cash. They had spare capital to invest. And that's why, as I said, the financial aspect of the first industrial revolution was not really a problem, because there was nothing else to invest in that gave you these phenomenal returns, 5 times the size of investing in the government, for example. And the rise of joint stock companies, again, vitally important, because there had to be a method in law of people getting together safely, so that people could band together and put their money in a single pot, and that pot could be used to develop a business. Particularly after the collapse of the South Sea bubble, joint stock companies, where the directors were liable for the entire potential losses of the business, were an extremely popular method of people banding together and putting money in a pot. This was what made the building of foundries and pits by people like Abraham Darby doable, and what made factories and canals doable for people like Josiah Wedgwood. Now, Wedgwood was born in 1730 and died in 1795, so his lifespan really covered the span of the important part of the first industrial revolution. So, unlike the Darbys sort of had what we would today call a vertically integrated business, in that they turned coal and iron ore and coke, most importantly, into consumer products, pots and pans. But as time went by, the industrial aspect of their business, including, I might say, selling iron ore and coal to all sorts of other people. For example, they shipped coal down the Severn to Bristol and through the West Midlands, and it provided heating for people's homes because, as I previously mentioned, most of the forests of England that could be used had been used. And charcoal, which is obviously a product of burning wood, had just become very expensive and just wasn't available in the necessary quantities. So, yes, we've got our friends Abraham Darby, the Darby family were busy with pots and pans, but Wedgwood was a master potter. He turned what was a fairly unpleasant product, i.e. ceramic, plates, mugs, bowls, and many decorative items. He turned that from a small craft industry into a massive industry. How did he do it? Well, he was, apart from being a master potter, he was also a genius as a businessman. He developed a vertically integrated system for making and marketing his products direct to the consumer. He was maker, designer, distributor, and marketeer of his products. For example, he opened a showroom in London in 1768 at the top of St Martin's Lane. So successful was this retail venture that Wedgwood had to relocate to larger premises in Greek Street, Soho in 1774, allowing much wider distribution of his product in London and the near home counties. Nor did he confine his activities to Great Britain. Once he built up the output of his factory, and he had helped to sponsor a canal that could connect Stoke-on-Trent to the rest of the canal system, he could buy, towards the end of his life, he was in a position to export to all points of the globe. And indeed, Catherine the Great of Russia took delivery of a 952-piece of dinner service from him in creamware in 1774. In 1774, having experimented for decades, Wedgwood launched a decorative range of pottery items called Jasperware, which became so popular that it remains in production today, 200 plus years after the death of Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood didn't, like the Darbys, he didn't become successful overnight, but he did turn his business into a multi-generational family business. Now, the advantage of a family business is you can borrow money, you can take in investors, but they're not members of the family. I speak as somebody who married into a family business that is now on its fourth generation of managing directors coming from the founder's family. Wedgwood, for example, refused a partnership, even from his eldest brother in 1749, and he spent the next decade in a variety of partnerships which taught him skills about business and how to handle difficult partners. In 1759, he set up his own factory in Burslem, which is one of the 7 towns of Stoke-on-Trent, all of which are famed for pottery manufacture. In 1765, Queen Charlotte, King George III's wife, ordered a creamware dinner service, and Wedgwood, having sought permission, renamed the creamware Queensware. A very, very good example of early branding. Having opened a showroom and shop in London, Wedgwood went on to develop the art of marketing. Many common sales techniques such as direct mail, money-back guarantees, free delivery, celebrity endorsement, after all the Queen bought his stuff, illustrated catalogues, and buy one and get one free came from Josiah Wedgwood. In the last decade of his life, Wedgwood ploughed some of his profits into the abolition of slavery. The Wedgwood factories in Stoke remain in production today, 230 years after the founder's death. one of the reasons that virtually all of Catherine the Great's dinner service arrived intact is because virtually its entire journey was via water, via the canal system to Hull, and then from Hull by ship to St. Petersburg. Wedgwood was not only a genius potter, but was clearly one of the first to realise that retail is detail, and every aspect of getting his consumer product to the end user needed his input. So really that deals with the rise of consumer goods. We've talked at length about canals, which were critical to the development of the Industrial Revolution. What we have failed to cover yet is the most important aspects of the Industrial Revolution, and that is the rise of the factory system and the development of weaving, spinning and weaving of cotton products in Lancashire and woolen products in Yorkshire. Now, we come back to the fact that the reason that mills, which would come to be called factories when they were much wider, their factories had another name really up until the end of the 18th century, and that is they were a place to store goods. For example, British traders in St. Petersburg, and for example, the trader who would have handled the arrival of Catherine the Great's dinner service, operated from what were called, their warehouses were called factories. But the development of the first Industrial Revolution changed the meaning of the word factory forever. The factory became where consumer industrial goods for sale were produced. And by far the most important product that from the middle of the 18th century through to the first quarter of the 19th century was the production and treatment of cotton. Now, at the beginning of this period, cotton was coming in from, unbelievably, the Sugar Islands. There was very little cotton being made in what came to be the southern United States. But one of the things that the British Empire became unbelievably good at was redeploying agriculture. And the last half of the 18th century saw an absolute boom of cotton plantations in what is now the southern United States. Really the only one that was in the hands of the English settlers in America by the end of the American Revolutionary War was Virginia. Now, Virginia, phenomenal for growing tobacco, pretty good in the hottest parts for growing sugar and rice, but so-so for cotton. Pretty good for cotton, but not the best land for cotton. The best land for cotton was farther south, in the Carolinas, in Georgia, and in Tennessee as well. All these places were great for growing cotton. Now, cotton is is a plantation product. What that means is it means that you employ your land to grow a cash crop. The cash crop in this case was cotton, and there was obviously part of your plantation probably had land that wasn't suitable for growing cotton, so you grew the food that the people who grew the cotton needed to survive. And of course those people were largely slaves, imported, as we've already mentioned, via the triangular trade. So the original supply of cotton came from the Caribbean. This was eclipsed by the supply from the southern United States that developed after the American Revolutionary War. And certainly by
the very early 19th century, in Britain, cotton was by far the most important export product. Now, bales of cotton don't just turn into clothes. They require a significant number of industrial processes through which they need to go. Firstly, the raw cotton needs to be spun into thread. The thread then needs to be treated and probably dyed. So that's another process. It then needs to be spun on looms into cloth, and the cloth then needs to be turned into either just sent out in rolls of material, or it needs to be turned into what then came to be called piece goods. In other words, you could take your coloured cloth and you could turn it into clothes. Now, who were the people who were buying these clothes? Well, they were the people working in the factories, because obviously if you were working a 60, 70-hour week, you were simply too tired to make your own clothes. So they provided the first low-level market for made-up cotton goods. But of course, it wasn't just only the UK that needed these either bolts of cloth or made or piece goods, as they were called. It was the globe. And unfortunately, for places like India, where they were still making cloth, they were still making cotton the old way. Once industrialized rolls of cotton started to arrive, as they did from the very late 18th century and into the 19th century, we were in a situation where people simply could not, they just couldn't compete. Now, one of the reasons, of course, that these factories grew up in places like Lancashire and woolen factories grew up in places like Yorkshire was because a factory was a controlled situation. One of the problems, there was obviously production of cotton being turned into goods by independent weavers who essentially worked in their own little cottages from the very early 18th century, even earlier. But there was a problem. There was no discipline in the workforce. So the weavers would finish their work late on a Saturday afternoon. They would pick up the money from the sale of the cloth that they had created that week. And what would they do then? Well, most of them would get blind drunk. And they would drink all through Saturday night and Sunday. On Monday, they'd probably used up the week's supply of money. Maybe there was food in the house, maybe there wasn't. And they would get over their hangover. Then on Tuesday, they'd buckle down and start producing again. Now, as you might imagine, the people buying this cloth weren't terribly happy because they were in the hands of a drunken workforce. So that, in a nutshell, is why the factory system, the mill system, grew up in Lancashire and Yorkshire. Because the workforce operating from home was getting drunk all the time. I know it sounds simplistic, but that is really what it's about. You see, you've got to think about it this way. Although we've talked about two businesses, Wedgwood and the Darbys, that were family businesses, even by the 1760s, not all businesses were family businesses, and there were plenty of people banding together in joint stock companies, lending varying amounts of capital to do whatever the business set out to do. Being at the mercy of a drunken workforce obviously ensured that you weren't in control of your business, because the workforce, drunken or getting over its hangover, was in control of the business. that's one of the reasons why cotton manufacturers loved the concept of factories. In factories, you could check whether the people were coming in equipped with bottles of gin. You could stop them drinking. You could even stop them going to the toilet. You could exercise discipline. Now, the problem is that you can't take these drunken weavers and put them in factories. They won't adjust to it. They'll still find a way to get booze in. So weaving had to become a process of mass production. And fortunately, because of inventions like the spinning jenny and power looms, i.e. looms that could turn the thread into cloth, power looms became possible and sufficiently sophisticated that they needed to be operated by untrained, very simply trained staff. That's how the factory system came about. In other words, control of the working capital moved from the workforce, independent, getting drunk, living in their homes, to the workforce that was under your control in your factory. And as I say, you could even stop them going you could say, right, you can have a toilet break 3 times a day. This was so much more efficient for massaging your capital. The two things cannot be compared. And families worked in factories. Children as young as 7 and 8 were picking up stuff under the looms, and were getting their hair caught in the looms and dying. The factory system was not a likeable or lovable scenario, but it was efficient. And that's all that capital requires. Capital seeks efficiency. And in the factories, they got it. So the other point is that powered looms, being powered by water or eventually by steam engines, could work 24/7. So you could work your machinery and your building 24 hours a day. You could have 2 or even 3 shifts a day if you could sell the output. But of course, because your machines were producing 24 hours a day, they were producing at a much lower cost per yard of cloth. And that is why it became possible for Britain to export cotton, rolls of cotton, to India, where there were literally millions of people working hand looms. So the factory system improved productivity out of all understanding compared to drunken weavers. So that really takes care of cotton. Now, cotton became by far the most important export that Britain had. But let us go back to iron for a moment. One of the things, if you could cast iron to a higher standard, which because of the Derbys became possible, you could make, for example, if you could drill out holes in your big piece of cast iron, you could make cannon. Now, of course, that gave you a pretty relentless market, because from 1750 to 1815, Britain was at war with somebody pretty well the whole time. And it kept getting on for, and then more than, 100 battleships. What do I mean by a battleship? I mean a ship of the line. A ship of the line had frequently 74 guns. In fact, that was the standard British size of a ship of the line. But we also had bigger ships like HMS Victory, which had 100 plus guns. Now, these guns were precision-made bits of iron. So they had to be drilled. In other words, you cast the iron, it was a solid lump in the shape of a big bottle, and then you had to drill out the hole through the centre of the iron. This required steel, so to make the drill, and originally, of course, the drill was driven by hand. But then it was driven by water, by wind power, and eventually by steam. So you could drill out this big lump of iron and turn it into a cannon. Once the drilling became much more precise, you could drill it out and you could make a cannon that was unique to the Royal Navy, called a carronade. Now, a carronade was a much lighter cannon that could still fire a very heavy weight of cannonball. And that but because the actual cannon was lighter, it required a smaller crew of 3, not a crew of 7. Now that meant a much more efficient rate of fire, and you could have more guns for a smaller crew. Now, carronades were not used by other countries, and we didn't sell them to other countries because we wanted the best navy in the world. The best navy in the world was equipped with ships that were partially equipped with carronades. So you can see why the concept of the machine tool, which also is well seated in the First Industrial Revolution, came about. Because, for example, you had to be the drilling out of the bit of cast iron that you were turning into a cannon had to be absolutely precise. If it wasn't precise, the cannon could either blow up because the ball got stuck and the force moving the cannonball forward had nowhere to go, so the actual cannon blew up. Or you could make other tools that the originator of the science of economics, Adam Smith, were being used in Birmingham particularly to make small iron products. Pins, for example. Pins they can be quite large. They can be maybe as large as 6 inches, 8 inches. But think of the number of pins that are required by people making clothes. They need to pin up the hem, and then they need to stitch the hem. And imagine you're repeating this at 100 tables. This is a factory making piece goods. So, things like pins didn't only require skilled craftsmen, they required machine tools, operating, helping to make the pin. And this, again, is a key part of the latter part of the First Industrial Revolution. Now, we haven't really covered how steam engines came about. Now, I've left this towards the end because, yes, the steam engine was important even by the 1760s because it was able to pump water, for example. It could pump it up a pipe 100 foot long, which meant that you could, if you'd got water seeping into your coal mine or your iron ore mine or your tin mine, you could, at least for 100 feet, pump it out. And this was probably one of the original uses for a steam engine. And actually, if you want to go and see a steam engine, that did things like pumping water out of coal mines or tin mines, you could do worse than visit London and go to the Science Museum, where they have a machine, they have a steam engine that is doing precisely that. That's what it does, it pumps. Now, obviously, one of the things when and you'll see, it's a huge machine, but as time went by, you could scale things down. And eventually, you could scale things down so that you could perhaps move a steam engine from one place to another. And that certainly happened in dockyards, in factories, in coal mine, in all forms of mines, and by the docks, not just sea docks, but by the docks that existed in the canal system. So, for example, Josiah Wedgwood's crockery, he might have a big shipment of crockery, a third of which was going to London, but the other 2/3 was going to Hull, so that it could be sent to Scandinavia and Russia. So you can see why the manufacturing of things like barges became so important, because barges ensured that, and narrowboats became very, very important. Narrowboats were generally speaking largely made out of wood. But of course the timber for the narrowboats was probably imported either from the Baltic or it was imported from Canada. So the narrowboat was an important feature because not all canals were that wide. And indeed, if you had a canal that, for example, used a viaduct, and that was a very simple way of making a canal cross a valley between two hills, if you were actually running your canal along the top of a hill, not unheard of, and suddenly there was a deep dip into a valley, well, surely a bridge that could take the canal across the valley was better than a whole stream of locks down and then the same stream of locks up. And that also happened. Now that meant that what was called civil engineering, that's the use of bricks and stone to make useful objects like bridges, like viaducts, like tunnels. Canal tunnels had to be lined to stop earth dropping into the canal. That meant a vast requirement for bricks. Bricks are best cast from clay, and so if you're fortunately, there is plenty of clay in Lancashire and to a lesser extent in Yorkshire. So bricks were made by the million to make factories and mills. Other places required millions of bricks. London had clay. London's largely built on clay. So you had clay fields where you could make bricks, and then the bricks could be transported along the Thames and then up little canals to the place they were needed. So brickmaking's a very important feature, and the development of brick fields and brick making in and around big cities is again very important to the growth of those cities. So we've dealt with consumer goods, we've dealt with industrial goods, and we've dealt with, very importantly, military goods. Because again, one of the ways that Britain, a much smaller country than France, for example, managed to defeat France relentlessly from 1742 to 1815. One of the reasons we were able to relentlessly defeat France is because we had undergone
an industrial revolution, which French, if you look back to, say, the period immediately preceding the American War of Independence, so late 1760s, early 1770s, you could have looked at France and you could have looked at Britain, and their industrial development was similar. Now, industrial development in the UK was not put on hold, but it certainly, the pace at which it was developing slowed down a lot during the American War of Independence. The American War of Independence took up a vast amount of the working capital of Great Britain, because the people we could borrow from, for example the Dutch, were largely pro the independence of America. You know, Britain was becoming too big, too powerful, too quickly in the middle to the end of the 18th century. You know, we weren't a vast country, but we were able to defeat the most powerful country in Europe regularly, and that was the French. And we were able to defeat them because we were undergoing the Industrial Revolution. As I say, look back to the late 1770s, early 1780s, i.e. the sort of middle and the end of the American Revolutionary War, and you see two countries that are quite similar economically. But look again at 1815 and you see complete transformation. That transformation ensured that many of Napoleon's soldiers had British cloth on their backs. Many, they had boots from Northamptonshire. They didn't have British cannon and they didn't have British muskets, but plenty of kings in West Africa did have British muskets, and indeed some of them had a few British cannon. So by 1815, Britain had stormed ahead of all other European countries in terms of industrialisation. And now we come on to the final aspect of the first industrial revolution, the moving steam engine. Yes, I mean, of course, the railways. Now, railways had existed certainly since the very earliest part of the Industrial Revolution. They were called trackways, and trackways had all sorts of different little trucks being pulled by horses or donkeys or men up and down from pit heads to where the coal was going to be put on barges or boats or ships, for example. It had trackways that connected Abraham Darby's iron ore smelting places. They had a trackway that would have moved the liquid iron to the moulds. Couldn't move the moulds, they were made of sand. The same applied in the cotton and woolen factories. You needed little trackways to move the raw materials and indeed the finished goods around. Now, these trackways were originally made from wood. So there were wooden tracks, wooden wheels, but of course, as Abraham Darby's and his followers became much more widespread, they were replaced by iron tracks, iron wheels, little iron boxcars. And eventually, it was possible to miniaturise the steam engine to the extent that you could have a small steam engine pulling these little cars from A to B and then back again. This meant that as long as you had a powerful enough steam engine, you could, for example, pull 20 tons of iron ore up a hill. Now, only with the coming of the steam engine could you replace either human or animal power to effect the movement of these trucks. And first of all, there were stationary static steam engines with ropes or chains which could pull 5, 10, 15 tons, 20 tons of goods up a hill. Eventually, however, clever people started to look at the concept of putting a steam engine on wheels and driving the wheels with the power from the steam engine. And when we get to the 1820s, this becomes a practical endeavour. And in the middle of the 1820s, there was a competition which was entered by 12 or so different engineers to create an engine that could pull people. The winner of the competition was, of course, famously George Stephenson, with his first moving steam engine, successful practical steam engine, called the Rocket. Now, the Rocket meant that you could have a line of trucks full of coal or iron ore or cotton, raw cotton, as long as the trucks were clean and covered. And you could move goods efficiently and fast. You could move goods, if goods were being moved by a horse pulling a barge down a canal, you were getting maybe 6, 8 miles an hour. But a functioning, moving steam engine could move goods at 20 miles an hour. Now, originally, people working on these thought that these would be mainly used literally for moving goods. Well, they were wrong, because astoundingly, yes, that was the very first thing that the first railway did. It moved goods from Stockton to Darlington in northeast England. But really, the first steam engine journey that got people really intrigued as to what could be done with a moving steam engine was when a line was built from Manchester to Liverpool. Now, it wasn't easy to build from Manchester to Liverpool because there's a thing called the Chat Moss. The Chat Moss is a more or less bottomless pit, or apparently a bottomless pit of swamp. Anyway, the builders of the Manchester to Liverpool railway, and that's what it became to be called, a railway, they managed to get through that because they built the railway up to the Chat Moss, and then the first thing they did was the first goods, as it were, that the railway moved was thousands, tens of thousands of rolls of timber in bunches. And they were just thrown into Chat Moss until it formed a sound enough base over which you could roll the railway. But of course, you couldn't really have done it efficiently without having the railway coming up to the Chat Moss with thousands of bundles of timber. So, the railway was opened to great fanfare, and it was still necessary to pull the railway engine and its carriages, well, half carriages, full of people up a hill into the railway station at Liverpool using a static engine in addition to the engine that was pulling the train. And unfortunately, very few of the political classes understood not necessarily railway engines, because they were still practically unknown, and what they could achieve was unknown. But they had little or no understanding of what was going on in Lancashire and Yorkshire. They could see the money was pouring out of Lancashire and Yorkshire, and was pushing the price of land up. Because, of course, one of the things that the factory owners of Yorkshire and Lancashire wanted to do was become accepted within the gentry and later even the aristocracy. And, of course, to do that, you needed to buy land, and you need to be quite a large landowner. We're not talking hundreds, we're talking thousands of acres. Anyway, the one of the few politicians was a man who understood the new factory system, the new system of steam and foundries and pits and factories. He was a man called Huskisson. Now, the inaugural journey from Manchester to Liverpool involved various stops. And unfortunately, Huskisson got out of his carriage, and this was literally a half carriage on iron wheels, on the wrong side. And he got out on the side where there was a train coming in the opposite direction. And so we have the first death by railway. Huskisson tripped and fell in front of the oncoming train. The oncoming train couldn't stop and ran over him. Now, he wasn't killed instantly, but he died in less than 24 hours. Nevertheless, this rather inopportune political death did not stop the railways. And there was a boom in railway building, which went on from the late 1820s to the 1840s in Britain. And Britain became the most railway covered country in the world. Now, surprisingly, the next country to industrialise was not Germany, wasn't the United States, all of which you would have expected to have been in a position to get on with their industrial revolutions. It was Belgium. Now, Belgium was particularly interested in the late 1820s and early 1830s in railways. Why? Because Belgium had split off from the other part of Belgium called Holland. And the Dutch monarchy no longer controlled Belgium. Belgium, in fact, invited in its own king in the 1830s. And the Belgians have a pretty flat country, other than the Ardennes, but what they didn't have was access to the river Scheldt. The Scheldt is the most important river in the Scheldt, and the Lower Rhine are the most important rivers in Belgium and Holland. And because they didn't have access to the Scheldt, because the Dutch were forbidding them access, and the Dutch had an army and a navy, and the Belgians didn't at this stage, the Belgians needed to build railways to overcome this, and build they did, and they built the railway system very, very quickly. And this helped their industrial revolution. In a way, lots of British engineers and factory owners went over to Belgium and helped them, obviously for a price. And what this meant was it meant that a country that was strategically disadvantaged overcame the disadvantage by having an industrial revolution. Britain used its industrial revolution to become, without question, the most powerful nation on the planet between 1815 and 1875, or thereabouts. Britain did not, however, make as good a fix of the Second Industrial Revolution, but that's a story for another day. So there we are, the First Industrial Revolution and why it took place in
Britain. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and watch our next episode.